Hello, welcome to TelecomTV at the OPNFV Summit in Beijing. My name is Tony Chan, and joining me on this panel discussion is Susan James from Ericsson. We have Bala Thekkedath from Hewlett Packard Enterprise, and Chris Wright from Red Hat. So you guys been obviously involved members of this community. What do you think is the key enablers for communication service providers to actually accelerate the adoption of network functions virtualization? Susan?
I think there's a couple of things. Obviously, the initial deployment and onboarding of applications often takes too much time. So I think OPNFV initiatives around the testing and acceptance testing becomes really important. But one of the things I think that we see as a real challenge is how operators scale this deployment when it's in operation. So it's very easy to, well, it's easier to go in with a small, but how do you actually then grow that, onboard more applications and really grow the infrastructure? I think that's some of the challenges that we've seen delaying the mass deployment of it, and I think that that's something that we're very focused on fixing going forward.
Bala, you see any key enablers?
Yeah, I think I agree with what Susan said. In the end, I think it boils down to risk mitigation. So when we embarked on NFV, we traded risk versus agility. There's a trade-off of you could do things faster, you could do things in a much different way. But when it comes to actual deployment, there's the risk of interoperability, there's the risk of scaling. And then there's the risk of entire, the processes that have to be changed, acceptance testing, verification, procurement, licensing. So all of those things are, we have taken care of some of the technical issues now with interoperability. There are a lot of initiatives on interoperability, especially at the infrastructure level. We have worked on automation and orchestration, trying to, there's still a lot of options for orchestration, but they're coming together. But I think we see some of the big challenges in how this is procured and deployed and licensed and getting into commercial production. I think some work there would help speed up deployment.
Yeah,
Chris?
I mean, I think we're past the point of just making the basic platform functional. And that was a big focus. That actually took us quite a long time. And so we should pat ourselves on the back for that, be really proud, because we couldn't be where we are today if we hadn't really built that core functionality. We're building a complex system, and so the initial deployment is that first experience you have with bringing this into your network, and the rest is about operations, interoperability, and I think that's really the key challenge that we're looking at today. So if you look maybe a year ago, an OPNFV Summit, we were still talking about how we're making the platform functional, and the initial deployment. Now we're talking about critical interoperability testing, because operators want to build their networks out of combined solutions with different vendors involved. That actually requires procurement changes, and one of the things I see is in that procurement cycle, the operator's mindset, the technology side has changed, but the process for bringing in new technologies hasn't really caught up, and that creates some friction. And then a lot of work in creating the orchestration tier to really drive that interoperability and get away from the vertically integrated stacks that are really what the operators are most familiar with.
So what you guys have described right now are pretty complex systems with many, many components. So I'm assuming interoperability is going to be an issue. Does the OPNFV play a role in this, in facilitating that?
I think, from my perspective, I think OPNFV is really great at that first round of integration more than interoperability, where we're putting all the components together for the first time. So of course it does support with interoperability going forward. But I think where we actually put real products together from an interoperability perspective will be more in the NFV ITI sort of interoperability testing initiative. But I still think that it's really important to have done that pre-work before you get to NFV ITI.
Yeah, I think there's some actual work to do to define how we onboard applications and make clear what the interfaces are between orchestration layer, application itself, or the VNF itself, and the underlying platform. it's work we're still doing in the industry. We're aware of the requirements. We've got some good ideas of how we can build towards creating the right level of infrastructure to support interoperable systems. But I think there's actual, just basic engineering work to do to get us that next step.
Yeah, I think the work that we're doing here really, gets that base going. But then if you are talking about applications for network, that's a work that has to happen both within the open source community and within the vendor community with the CSPs. So if you have an application that requires X VNFs and X infrastructure, putting that together in many cases is happens on a case-by-case basis, on a customer pull basis. And the work that we're doing here is actually making that go faster.
Yeah.
That's the biggest advantage that we're getting out of it.
Sounds to me like there's an opportunity for consolidation here of the two organizations.
I think they're doing very different things. I mean, this is very much an open source community where we're feeding requirements back up to open source projects. When you're talking about interoperability testing, it's commercial products, so it's a slightly different focus, and that's between vendors rather than sort of in a community kind of environment. So I think there's a role for both, to be honest, and it means that by doing that interoperability testing, you don't necessarily have to do that on site in the customer's premise for the first time. So I think this is a nice blend of taking what has worked in the telecommunications networks previously, but also marrying it together with how the IT networks typically work. So I think it's an evolution of both communities, actually.
Do you guys have anything to add?
Well, I guess the one point that Susan touched on was we are creating a platform in OPNFV, and so there's integration work that we're doing there that really matters. That platform, independent of commercialization, is a place where we can do these early stage kind of, maybe it's not true interoperability testing, but it's at least giving us the first view into how different components will work together.
I mean, it's very much the end-to-end functional testing that typically we would have traditionally standardized, then gone away, developed independently, then gone back into IoT interoperability testing and done it that way. I think what we do now is we, as a community, do our independent development. We come into OPNFV. We actually do the end-to-end in OPNFV to make sure that the functionality is actually done in all the right places. And in some cases it's not, and we need to go back to the upstream and fix it there. But then when we do the commercialization of that product, the interoperability there is actually on the interfaces between the components rather than so much on the end-to-end functionality, because that we should have already verified as part of the OPNFV.
Yeah. And I think that's the reason you are seeing a lot of ecosystems develop even outside of OpenNFV to commercialize these deployments. So when the procurement itself will move to a completely horizontal model as opposed to a vertical stack, the only way to take a solution to a customer is if you've already verified some level of interoperability, and that means the infrastructure, the middleware, and then the actual applications. And many times that applications are, that's where the intellectual property is. So they're not inherently open source products.
There's one nice thing to point out that Susan touched on was the standardization is a long, drawn-out process. It's important to have clear interfaces and interoperability. With open source software development processes and collaborative creation of a common platform, we can sort of short-circuit some of the standardization process and actually really accelerate what we're trying to achieve here. And I come from an open source background, so to me that's really exciting to see where we can help push the industry a little faster. We're not going to abandon standards, but we need to understand where de facto standardization can happen through collaboration and common code bases.
So I think we're still trying to find a nice balance actually between open source and standardization. I think maybe we're not quite there yet in terms of where we need to be to get the optimum speed. I think there is still some more work to do there, but for sure we're in a better position than we were, say, 3 or 4 years ago. But I think it's still a learning experience and a journey to find really how we get the best definitions in place and execution and then products out onto the market. So not quite sure we're there yet, but we're certainly a lot closer than we were a couple of years ago.
Okay, I'm going to deviate from the questioning just because you're leading up to, you've been talking about standards and open source. I mean, there's one standard coming up that everybody's talking about, which is 5G. And it seems to me that it's going to involve a lot of network virtualization. Is there a chance that open source kind of initiatives will actually become part of the standard for 5G?
Well, I think that they already are. I mean, if you look at, 5G itself is a sort of radio access, but what we're talking about is it's not just about the radio access. What happens to all that data that sits out there in the edge that are being collected by the IoT devices? I mean, that's what we're talking about in mostly the transformation that needs to happen on the core network side to deal with the change of flow of data through the network. So typically it flows out today. It will actually change to flowing in. So we need to build networks in a much more flexible way. And how we do that is by implementing NFV. And so it is containing OpenStack, it contains Open Daylight, OVS, ONAP. I mean, it's the whole alphabet soup of open source projects that actually end up building that infrastructure going forward. So I see it as being very complementary in that journey and the transformation that we're making.
I think all the work that has happened in the last 4 years on SDN, NFV, and the work that's happening now on edge computing, they are all laying the foundation for 5G. Yeah. 5G is going to use every single thing that we have done. Nothing of this is going waste. We look at it as in a three-step way, looking at creating a fabric of compute everywhere and creating a network that matches the distributed compute. So the network is programmable, and like Susan said, all that data that has to be analyzed so that decisions can be made autonomously, because you cannot do this manually anymore. You cannot do this manually anymore with every single part moving. So I think the way everything that is happening now is influencing even the standardization work that's happening in 3G. So we are pushing the envelope on standardization with what we are doing here.
Yeah, we're a prerequisite. So there's absolutely standards required. So the radio interfaces, device interoperability, that's a level where our open source communities are not going to be as influential. But we're building the key prerequisites. I don't think 5G is realizable without all the infrastructure that we're putting in place today.
Getting back to OPNFV, what are your respective organizations doing within the OPNFV community and with your customers and partners?
I think we're contributing in a number of ways, whether that be on the specific projects. We're involved in quite a number of projects, but I think also we're doing quite a lot of the community work. I think that's also really important to maintain a community. The areas that I think we want to continue to focus on is very much around the testing side of things, but also very much around the operations day-to-day that I referred to before. I think they become absolutely crucial. But I think also how the communities evolve together. So how we do the integration with Open Daylight becomes very important. But this end-to-end, so we're doing quite a lot of work around the end-to-end functionality to make sure that the capabilities are in place for the VNFs going forward, so that we can provide the kind of experience for those VNFs that they require.
I think it's pretty much the same. The contributions that we are doing are also along the lines of interoperability testing, being part of the Pharos lab network, so that end-to-end solutions can be tested on different infrastructure, and we provide the infrastructure for that as well. And outside of OPNFV as well, we are doing similar work. We have an ecosystem of application partners and VNF partners that test end-to-end applications and their orchestration on our infrastructures. We are also trying to do it, and the lessons that we are learning from there, we are bringing it back here and sharing it within the community as well.
We're spending our time in a few key areas. One is making the whole system deployable, and part of that initial deployment includes integration with other components, so whether it's an SDN controller. I mean, the key deployment here, I think, is OpenStack, but there's other components that are involved, and so that deployment tool becomes a point of integration for all the pieces that need to come together to build up the NFV platform. Big focus for us. Another area has been performance, so we continue to push the envelope on performance because two things are happening. One, we're having success, which is a good thing, so we need to keep showing the commercial value of reducing the cost by using standard high-volume hardware. The other thing is network speeds are increasing. So whatever we've established as a baseline for today may not be the right number for the future. So we have to keep pushing that forward, and we're looking at some performance testing as well as performance optimized stacks. So the fast data stack is an example in the OPNFV project. Another area that's important to us is service assurance, so that we can show that the application that you're running is actually providing the service that the service provider is agreeing in an SLA with their customer to provide. And so there's metrics that we need to extract from the underlying infrastructure, analyze, and potentially change the runtime operations of the system. That's actually an area that OpenStack today doesn't have enough supporting infrastructure. So OPNFV, I think, has actually really helped make changes in the upstream community. And then the other area, which is kind of our real core focus, is all the ancillary projects that are outside of OPNFV that we bring in and combine to create the OPNFV platform. We spend a lot of time in those communities, in OpenStack and Linux and KVM and Open vSwitch and DPDK and Open Daylight and that whole stack.
So it sounds to me that OPNFV plays a key role in kind of bringing everything together. But within carriers, one of the things that they're not quite famous for is actually adopting change, right? So when you have a platform that changes constantly, how do you actually help service providers engage that community if you want them to adopt this kind of solution?
I think there's already a number of initiatives. We were talking about it earlier this week, and it's difficult to see where it will actually fit. Whether it fits into ONAP or whether it fits into OPNFV. But I mean, we already see a number of initiatives around how you actually do the life cycle management, not only of the infrastructure components, but also of the VNFs. Because and this was where the whole sort of DevOps model comes in, and CI/CD becomes so important, because if you change one component, of course, then you need to make sure that it's not impacting anything else in the stack. So where a lot of that focus is around understanding and automating the test suites to make sure that if you change something, how does that impact everything else? What you see before, is it still equal or better than what you get when you get after you've made the change? So I think that's one of the areas within OPNFV that they are really leading in terms of, particularly within the open source communities, around how we're working with CI/CD. And you talked about Pharos as well. I think the way we're working with these sorts of things becomes really crucially important within the community. Of course, then you need to translate that into then the service providers' network, so they also can take advantage of that. This is going to be a challenge to really move operators and trigger the operators to move to a much more dynamic way of taking software into their network. So, the whole CI/CD DevOps becomes really a trigger point for them to move going forward.
I think one of the other advantages that OPNFV has is it's giving the CSPs that are participating a very safe space to change their work culture and competence of their organization, right? They are doing it in a pretty safe environment here. They're not being thrown out into the ocean and asked to swim.
And you have a community here that
to help them.
That shares knowledge, yeah.
So slowly they are trying to see what it would be to operate a network that doesn't look like the old network. So I think that is, to me, that's one of the big things that OPNFV brings for the operator community. Them participating here, even if they're not contributing code, like it was mentioned in the panel earlier today, even if they're not contributing code, they're seeing how it's being operated, how it has to be, how that network could be run or should be run. I think that's a big plus for them that will enable, again, acceleration of the deployments.
I know for a fact that Ericsson and Red Hat is supplying a solution to a major U.S. carrier. So perhaps you guys can share a bit of experience in helping a carrier deploy a platform that allows them to automate provisioning and cloud resources.
Right. I think the first thing is, Bala touched on this, we spend all of our time talking about technology, and when it comes to the agility required to consume change in your network just regularly, technology is critical, but it's really process, culture, people change, and that's a much harder part. So we can build a technology, we can solve a technical problem. It's really hard to change organizational structures and behaviors. And building tools around automation is critical. So in the cases where we do have successful service providers doing significant regular changes, they adopt certain types of best practices. And some of those are, you can roll out a piece of your infrastructure and direct a small part of your traffic to it. So you're not exposing your entire subscriber base to a change. As a simple example, and of course you're going to do some pre-production validation of that, but you need automation and tooling around that, and you also need the people involved to be inspired to take on the learning necessary to operate these new tools. Another example is being able to make these sort of small incremental changes actually can reduce risk overall. And we're operating in a risk-averse environment, so it's a really big mindset change. My preferred way of doing this is really bake it for 18 months until I know it's bulletproof, and then put it in production. And even there's
still things
potential
will go wrong.
for problems. And so now we're saying that you can make small incremental changes. There's always a mechanism to roll back or divert traffic elsewhere, and that's a kind of a mindset change that I think is facilitated by tools, but it's a long journey to get people.
But I think it's also when we start this journey, the first thing that nearly every single operator does is they say, actually, no one organization has the competence to do this. And the first thing they do is create a cross-functional team. As soon as they create a cross-functional team, it's not that immediate problem that they look at and they say, yeah, we need to solve that. They go, we also have the ability to solve a lot of the other issues that they have been blocking their organization, because now they have communications across organizations that previously didn't communicate with each other terribly well because they've been siloed. So I think the case that you were referring to is very much around looking at how do you actually automate processes across the organization. So you take something that typically is taking 28 days and 30 people to do, actually is automated down to 10 minutes, and maybe 7 people are involved in that. That's a huge organizational change, and it actually frees up a lot of people to actually start accelerating the roadmap and implementation of other projects, because you actually start to, most of these projects are limited by the fact that they have inability to get the right resources in place. When you start to implement these sorts of things and free up people, you actually are able to accelerate your roadmap on change in your network. So I think looking at the workflows and the processes that can be automated across the organization actually really become key. And in that particular case, it also gives you then the ability to make incremental changes in a much more controlled way, because you can see what happens before, what happens after. Am I okay with that? Yes, then we're good to go to the next step.
I think, I just, as you were talking, I just thought about something we had done. We looked at all the NFV POCs we had done and where they are after the POC. Did it go into commercial deployment? And if yes, why? And if no, why? And there was an interesting number. The POCs that were sponsored by multiple people within the organization had a 63% more chance of getting into commercial production than a regular POC if it was just sponsored by the CTO group or funded by the CTO group.
So a lot more ownership, and I think that's key actually, exactly. Because it's the way you do processes, the way you will actually manage that infrastructure going forward will change. I think That's one of the next big shifts I'm waiting to see. Still, most service providers are actually doing this in a application or a service type manner. What we see is some of them are actually starting to move, okay, I'm going to operate my infrastructure from one organization, and my applications will actually start to consume infrastructure, not consume capacity or plan their capacity. And I think that's the next big mind shift that needs to happen if we're really going to get the networks implemented in a very efficient way to allow us to take advantage of 5G going forward.
And
right.
That's exactly where we've seen success in the enterprise, where I think we're learning a lot of lessons that we're now applying into the network. And it's that separation of duty, owning, think of it as a platform, not as a vertically integrated stack. And that platform view is what drives interoperability requirements. Because as long as you have all these independent vertically integrated stacks, you can run them independently. You just haven't really created an efficiency of operations or procurement. And so where I see great success is building a common platform and bringing different applications and really thinking them of applications consuming resources on the platform rather than a vertically integrated
Because I think up until now, if you ask a VNF, they will all define their own requirements and they will be all different. They will use different language. And really we need to start, if we're going to have very efficiently deployed networks, the VNFs need to start being broken up into groups. I'm either a really a data plane heavy application, or I'm a fairly lightweight application. I don't need a lot of compute, I don't need a lot of memory, or I'm a really memory hungry application. So then you'll build sort of 3 different flavors of infrastructure that's then consumed by applications, rather than building 20 different types of infrastructure to suit each of the individual workloads. So I think that's sort of the next transition that we'll see going forward from an operator perspective.
And we are starting to see some of that trickle into some RFIs and RFPs, right? But it's really, for most part, that mindset has not changed, right? You still see requirements for 7-year support on OpenStack X version, but so that change will come.
I know OPNFV has been quite successful in attracting service providers as members, and I had a very interesting conversation this morning with a representative from an operator, and he was saying his role within the community is actually to point out what's missing. So because they know their network, they operate the network, they actually know what's missing within the community, and they would tell people to actually develop that features. So, from your perspective, how important is actually operators being part of the process?
I think it's crucial, actually. And it's different in different phases. So I think early on, we could do. I mean, it was hygiene, getting the basics in place. But I think absolutely now and going forward, that feedback on what they want to see next, how they believe they're going to build their networks, becomes absolutely crucial. Not just from an operation perspective, but also in things like how they're going to use the analytics, how they're going to distribute that cloud out into the network. We can have ideas of how that's going to happen, and we can provide technology, as Chris said, we're good at providing technology. But the then scenarios of, if it's deployed at a distance in Australia, that's going to be very different than if it's deployed in a distance in Germany, because simply the kind of underlying infrastructure that can be supported there is going to be very different. So it's really important that we understand the nuances of the deployment scenarios, or the challenges that they see in operating networks.
Bala?
I think it's not even an optional, right? It is not an optional question. They should be part of this. This is something that's being built for them, and now is the real chance of getting something that they really want to operate, and not take something that was cookie cutter made and then being sold, right? This is the time when we are building much more personalized network for every different operator, and that is possible now with the technology we have. So if they don't take advantage of that, I think it's just the waste of all this effort. Right?
I would agree. It's 100% critical, and it's one of the big values of open collaborative communities. Is usually we think of communities in the open source context wrapped around development and development activities, but we're building software for users, if users aren't a part of that community, it's not going to be nearly as successful. And we absolutely, the whole premise in the beginning to me for OPNFV was understanding the user requirements so that we could re-articulate those in a language familiar to the development communities, which in many cases are not used to the other acronym soup, which is the telco industry. Creating that kind of shared understanding, which all starts from the use cases, and the use cases are coming from the service providers. So 100% critical, and really the key value that collaborative communities can bring to bear.
And I think it's such a different mindset. I think that's where the initial challenge was. You know, the concepts of resilience, redundancy were words that we used, and we really didn't manage to get the understanding of what it is actually that we needed in place. So I think part of it was from a sort of telco background or a service provider background, is to get those requirements understood in the open source community was just so difficult. And it's quite interesting to see such a shift now from OpenStack to being, you know, from being very enterprise focused early on to being, you know, nearly the last couple of conferences have been so focused on you know, the service provider market as the next big market for OpenStack at least, that the willingness to embrace this feedback has been extremely strong. And I think OPNFV has grown from being how do we make our voice heard into the open source communities to say, okay, now we've evolved to actually saying how do you actually pull together a totality again, because it's very different to how you use software in an enterprise where you can just have software being quite isolated. You really do need to pull the whole together to make sure you get the kind of performance and characteristics, and that's quite different to most other open source communities, I would say. So it's really important that the service providers continue to embrace and work with it to continue the evolution of how we go forward. And you see that, I mean, in the conversations today. I mean, ONAP becomes so important to service providers to be able to do that automation of orchestration. And then how we pull that together in the OPNFV community, I think will continue to be critical going forward.
I think it's not only the solutions, because that's the use case, it's the end-to-end, which is unique to the network, but it's also understanding the operational requirements. What do you need? It's not just the functional requirements of how fast do I need to do packet processing, but it's what do you need to actually operate this infrastructure, and that's where projects like ONAP really do shine, because they're trying to help bridge the underlying infrastructure to the operational insight that's critical to operators. Are used to understanding what's going on in their network, and part of that is a long history of operational experience. And if you go to standards bodies, there's often an operational component to a standard. Here, we're trying to build that same operational experience so they get visibility and understand where things are working and how we need to redeploy or shift traffic around or shift applications. You can't do that if you don't actually understand from the operator's point of view what it means to successfully operate a network.
So you three have been, you know, working with OPNFV since the beginning. If you had access to the TelecomTV time machine, would you do anything differently?
Certainly. I think we do a few things differently, but I think one of the things that I would like to do differently, when we started with OpenStack, it was obviously not where we needed to be, so we did some modifications to that. What I would do is, we still would have done that, but I would have started the upstream work a lot earlier, so that we could have exited the, you know, doing our own code base much more quickly.
I was thinking more about what we should have done as a collective industry more. I think I would have liked to see a lot more CMOs and CEOs talk about NFV and SDN than the CTO's team. Yeah, that would have made a bigger difference, you know, 2 years ago, if we had much more business-related and operations-related discussions before, you know, while the technology was going in parallel. I think we started talking about operations a bit later, which is always the case.
Yeah.
Which is always the case. But, you know, every time we do it a little bit earlier.
I think I would have maybe done two things. One is look at some ways to introduce automation and that cultural change without making significant infrastructure changes, just to build some of that muscle memory and understanding of how to do automation and change your network without feeling like it's really the same risky process or risk-averse world that the operators have been steeped in. And then the other piece would be looking at it from an application point of view, where much of the work we did was platform-related and just enabling a simple migration, physical to virtual. Ultimately, we need to get to more cloud-native applications, and that's a long journey, and starting that as early as possible in parallel with changing the infrastructure is something I would have really wanted to champion more.
It would have been great if the applications had moved more quickly. I think now is the worst time to be an infrastructure provider because we have to be cloud native already, but we also still have to provide a lot of platform capabilities to the applications because in many cases they're not ready yet. So I agree, applications, we could have pushed them a bit harder.
Yeah.
Great. So thank you very much, Susan, Bala, Chris.